Who do you think you are? Aristotle said that knowing yourself is the beginning of all practical wisdom. So it's a big question. I've thought about it a lot. If Aristotle believes that knowing yourself is the beginning of all practical wisdom, it must be important. But what does it really mean to know yourself? Do I know myself as I really am? Or do I simply know the way I know myself, like self-perception? You see, as I've thought about it, I've realized that awareness of our perception isn't the same thing as knowing ourselves. It's partial. I'll give you an example. It's like gazing at the night sky. When I go outside or spend some extra time to look at the night sky, I'm always frustrated, a little bit, because I can't see everything. I see a few stars. Depending on the light pollution, I may not see any at all. But ultimately, I don't know the vastness of the night. I see only what my eyes can take in. To know the sky, I'd need a keener vision. When I look at the sky and see only those few stars, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm seeing all that's there. With the right lens, a good microscope, you can see the night sky with billions of stars and thousands of galaxies. And this would be what it is like to see things as they really are. And as I've thought about Aristotle's quote, I've realized that the same thing is happening. There are two dimensions of self-knowing. First, you know how you know yourself. This would be like me going outside in, I guess it doesn't matter, in the city or the countryside, looking at the night sky. I could see a dark blue, I could see the moon, I could make out maybe a few hundred stars on a good night, but I wouldn't be seeing everything. Ultimately, knowing how you know yourself comes through self-perception. It's called meta-awareness, and with meta-awareness, we become aware of the lens through which we view ourselves. It means that we recognize that our self-perception is shaped by experience, emotion, belief, and memory. But the most important thing about self-perception to understand is that it isn't accurate, nor is it fully complete. This leads us to the other dimension of self-knowing, where we know ourselves as we actually are. This would be taking a great camera with a great lens to view the vastness of the night sky. With the right lens, I could see billions of stars and make out the beautiful pictures of galaxies. I've always loved landscape photography because of the beauty that a great lens could capture. And I've realized that this is the same thing that's happening with our self-knowledge. The way I see myself and the way you see yourself is with only a few hundred stars. But what if you had the right lens? What beauty could you discover about billions of stars or thousands of galaxies for who you truly are? Ultimately, to know ourselves as we really are, we must see beyond the lens to what's true. For self-knowledge, it involves reconnecting with our core values, our actual capacities, desires, and ultimately potential. It means that we have to gain awareness of our underlying patterns, wounds, and blind spots. And so I think this is the self-knowledge that Aristotle was talking about. It's about closing the gap between who you think you are and who you actually are, with clarity, compassion, and curiosity. So why would Aristotle term this self-knowledge as the beginning of wisdom? Aristotle had a term in his day called phronesis, and in English today, it's called practical wisdom. Aristotle's term of phronesis isn't just abstract knowledge, but the ability to make good decisions in real life. So it's an applicable wisdom, a wisdom that applies to behavior. And so if this is the wisdom that Aristotle is referring to, what does self-knowledge have to do with that? Well, we can think about what we talked about last time with perception and its role in human behavior. Wisdom begins with self-knowledge because self-knowledge is about perception and gaining accurate perception. We don't act on objective reality, we act on our perception of it. Every decision we make is filtered through how we interpret ourselves, others, and the world. So this is what I think Aristotle was getting at. To live wisely, we must see, in particular, ourselves clearly. Self-knowledge is the pursuit of clear perception, and a clear perception, a clear understanding of who we are, leads to wiser decisions. My name is Dan Clark, and this is Wisdom Synthesized. And today, we'll be exploring this and more of Aristotle's quote of how we can know ourselves as we truly are. Previously, we explored the power of perception and how we make decisions. We learned that as we experience the world, we interpret what we experience. It's not just sensory data that comes into our brain, but it's sensory data that's interpreted based off of our previous experiences with that data and the value and affect that we've assigned it. Interpretation is unconscious. It happens with a framework that we've built in our minds of how we see ourselves, others, and the world. This interpretation, after it's processed unconsciously, it prompts an automatic response. And we can feel this with our emotions. Once we feel the automatic response, we have a moment to consciously intervene. Otherwise, the action is carried out. Ultimately, from our previous episode, we learned that we don't act on objective reality, but on our perception of it. And so today, we'll turn inward. Now that we know the role of perception and behavior, how does the way we see ourselves, how does self-perception influence our behavior? So we'll consider a few questions. First, what is self-perception? Second, how does it include beliefs about our strengths and weaknesses, our gifts and capacities and insecurities, our sense of worth and potential? Afterward, we'll think about this question. How does this self-perception influence our behavior? Things like what we pursue or what we avoid, what we tolerate or what we expect. And then we'll consider how can we gain self-awareness of our current self-perception. If it is flawed, how can we know in what ways it's flawed? And then lastly, once we gain an accurate self-awareness of our current perception, how can we educate it? How can we revise it? In that example, how can we put on a better lens, a clearer one to help us see things as they really are? To note on the importance of this conversation, I want you to think about this quote from Anais Nin. It reads, "We don't see things as they are, we see them as we are." It's a beautifully simple quote, and its implications are many. I believe self-perception is important because the way we see ourselves determines the limits or potential of our life. And so let's begin. What is our self-perception? In psychology, they have a term that is overarching, and it's called a self-model. And the self-model is a dynamic internal system. It's a system that our brain constructs to represent you to yourself. And so in this way, it's a simulation of sorts. It integrates our body and our physical state, our emotions and moods, our past experiences and memories, our current roles, traits, and identity, our intentions, imagined futures, and expectations. Ultimately, this model gives rise to the feeling of being someone. It's how we act and behave the way I see myself and act in the world. And so I use this term of self-model because it's overarching. It includes things like self-perception or self-concept. And it can be broken down into three main categories. Ultimately, it encompasses first, self-knowledge. That is what you believe about your traits, skills, identity roles. There are a few phrases that can explain this, of what an example would be. A thought like, I'm dependable, or I'm kind. This is what we believe about ourselves. Next, you have self-evaluation. And this is how you judge your worth and compare yourself to ideals. And here it includes internalized shame or pride, inadequacy or confidence. Do you believe in yourself? What are your insecurities? What do you feel inadequate about? And lastly, it includes self-prediction. What do you expect from yourself in the future? Now, predictions are cool because they're based on the past. And so based on what's happened previously with our life and experience and our choices, we expect that will have some weight in how our future goes. If I've given up before, I'll probably give up again. And so these are the main categories that encompass our self-model. And it's important to understand that our self-model operates beneath conscious awareness, unless examined intentionally. But, like I said, it sets the bounds. It can be limiting or empowering based off the bounds we have set for ourselves. And so let's take a look about how we can gain awareness of our current self-model. How has our self-model formed throughout time? It turns out that it started when we were born, from the first time we looked in the mirror and began to interpret and store those memories in our brain. In our childhood, adults played a big role in how our self-model was formed. We had internalized messages from caregivers that we believed in or trusted or respected or even feared, that we began to believe for ourselves. Phrases like, "You're so smart," versus "You're a troublemaker." And there's a theory in psychology called the looking glass self from Cooley, where he theorized that we come to see ourselves through others' eyes. And this has specific weight in our childhood, based on how others respond to us. If I'm seen as the smart kid from my teacher or my peers or my parents, then I'm treated differently. I may get extra attention in class, extra praise, extra encouragement. But if I'm seen as the troublemaker, I'll be treated differently than the smart kid. I may get more disciplining. And ultimately, this all influences us because as a child, we pay attention to how other people treat us. And with enough repetition, we begin to trust these messages. So think about it for yourself. With this reflection, what mirrors did you grow up with? Were you the smart kid, or were you the troublemaker? Or were you somewhere else? And after you consider what mirrors you grew up with, consider this. How clear were they? Were they true or false? And whether or not they were true or false, how much did you believe them? After you consider that for a few seconds, we'll talk about cognitive schemas. Now, I previously explained that cognitive schemas are a collection of information that is formed, but it's not just the information that it includes, but the appraisal. It's how much we value that information and affect, whether it's negative or positive. And so we construct cognitive schemas for ourselves with beliefs like I'm creative or I'm awkward. And we have a series of experiences, memories, and the opinions that people tell us that solidify these beliefs. Now, cognitive schemas are important because they filter new experiences. And as children, we gradually behave in a way that fits our schemas, in a way that maintains identity continuity. And so in this realm, think about this. What automatic labels do you use to describe yourself? And think, where did those labels come from? Afterward, we can think about autobiographical memory and narrative in how the self-model forms. As we grow up into adolescence and adulthood, we begin to stitch our experiences into a story. When I was 6, this happened. When I was 12, this happened. When I was 16, this happened. And we find patterns I've always been the one who blank. I could be the smart one, or the kid that got picked on, or the troublemaker. And as years stack on years, these stories begin to solidify. In the brain, the default mode network is active during this process. It links past and the present. But what's interesting about autobiographical memory and narrative is that it predicts the imagined future. Based on what's happened in the past, I can predict this about my future. If I'm the troublemaker now, I'll be the troublemaker later. And with any self-belief, it can be limiting or empowering. To consider this for yourself, reflect on this question. What story do you tell yourself about who you are based on who you have been? And now we'll go into social mirroring and comparison. Who we believe we are is influenced by comparison to peers, social roles, and feedback. And this is particularly important in how our self-model is formed because humans are social beings. We care about the opinions of others. So consider your own social feedback. Whether praise or exclusion or expectation is internalized into your model. Reflect, who did you compare yourself to growing up? And what did that teach you to believe about yourself? And then the last thing to consider about how our self-model was formed are the emotional moments of our lives and how those have bound to our identity. You see, emotionally charged moments are disproportionately encoded into our identity. Moments of failure, humiliation, or success, the human brain tags those, and they pay special attention and hold special weight to them. Ultimately, identities are emotionally fused. We remember not just what happened, but how it made us feel about ourselves. So you can think to yourself, in this regard, what did I internalize from experiences of rejection, embarrassment, or success? There's a lot to consider when we think about how our self-model is formed. And obviously, we can't take the time to dive into it now, but I share all these things with you to get an idea of some practices, some thought exercises that you can use for yourself to think about how your identity has formed over time. And most importantly, whether that identity is helping you or not. And to explain just what that means, we'll next talk about what the self-model does. I've written here, your self-model isn't just a description of who you are, it's a predictive system. It quietly guides your behavior, choices, and emotional reactions. So, we can go back to what the self-model is to explain that. As I've researched this, I found out that this really is true. Our self-model guides our behaviors, choices, and emotional reactions. Here's how. First, it's a predictive engine. It simulates what we will do, try, and avoid. It acts like an internal GPS. It maps our path, but it also includes invisible boundaries. For example, if I believe that I'm not a good public speaker, then that influences what I will try to do and what I'll avoid. Maybe I won't attempt because I don't believe I'm a good public speaker. Maybe if I get an assignment to public speak in a conference or something, my body will get overly nervous about it. And this all comes from my belief system about my capacity to public speak. And the funny thing is about the predictive engine is that as we go about our lives and as this guides our decisions, it reinforces the belief that we hold. It reinforces the model. Next, the self-model acts as a meaning filter. This means that it shapes how we interpret events, especially emotionally charged ones. To consider this, think about a breakup. Based on the beliefs you hold, you could say that from your breakup, I've learned that I'm unlovable. Or versus, you could think we were just not compatible. It could be the same breakup, the same situation, the same thing happened, but based on your beliefs, your interpretation could be completely different. And unlovable to not compatible means very different things, and it can have a very different implication and effect on a person. Next, it's an emotional regulator. That means that it determines how we process success and failure. For someone with a negative self-model, he or she could interpret setbacks as identity confirming, versus someone with a more flexible or positive self-model, a setback might feel just like feedback, a learning experience that you can grow from. And lastly, our self-model acts as an action scaffold. That means that it determines what behaviors feel aligned versus inauthentic, what feels in character versus what feels fake, risky, or out of bounds. And as we've discussed previously, humans love consonance. They love when there is consistency. And so people will resist acting out of character even when change is possible. And based on all these things that the self-model does, there are a few implications. I've written here that your self-model can be your greatest source of confidence or your most invisible limitation. And as I've done my research, I've realized that this is true. So let's think for a moment about the potential support that a self-model could be in our lives, the encouragement that it could bring. In our self-model, we could have confidence, a belief in our ability to handle challenge or discomfort. If it's a healthy self-model, we can have self-assurance. That means that we could have a secure sense of identity that isn't easily shaken by external criticism. Phrases like this: even if I'm misunderstood, I know who I am. Another positive aspect of a helpful self-model is a positive learning mindset. With a learning mindset, we can interpret failure as data, not identity. And lastly, a good self-model tells us a little bit about our capacity and our capability. If we believe in ourselves, we'll be willing to try and adapt. Now let's contrast this with the potential dangers of a self-model. What can happen when we have a negative self-model, one that limits us? First, I found in my research that leads to a rigid identity. Beliefs like "I've always been this way" inhibit change. And here we're tied to fixed mindsets and ego preservation. We can also have confirmation bias. That's where we selectively attend to the data that confirms our self-view. We may be able to see experiences, interpret experiences completely different than they actually happened in order to confirm what we believe about ourselves. In light of this, there's mnemic neglect, and this is a psychological tendency to forget or discount feedback that contradicts central beliefs. An example to illustrate this would be in dismissing compliments or successes as flukes because they don't match the self-model. I could be told by my friend that I'm smart, but with an unhealthy self-model, I could dismiss that all the way to the point where I just don't believe it at all. I don't believe I'm smart, so that compliment does nothing for me. And after this, we have identity foreclosure. And in this, we prematurely adopt a narrow self-definition to avoid ambiguity. An example of this is "I'm just the anxious one," where this self-belief becomes identity armor. It's protective but limiting. And then lastly, another danger of a negative self-model is internalized shame. When failures, rejection, or trauma happens, we confuse it to our identity. An example of this is telling ourselves, "I didn't just fail, I am a failure." Now, not to get overwhelmed about all the positive and negative things that can happen from a self-model, you can take a second to relax and listen to the story that's quite helpful and that actually many of you may know. And I've summarized an English translation from the original author, Hans Christian Andersen, that I'll read to you. It begins, "It was summer in the countryside. golden fields, deep green meadows, and a quiet old manor house, surrounded by a wide moat. Beneath the thick burdock leaves, a mother duck sat on her nest. Finally, her eggs began to crack, one after another, except for the largest one, which refused to break. But at last it hatched. Out tumbled a large, gray, and awkward duckling. "He doesn't look like the others," the mother said, "but he swims beautifully. He must be mine." Still, when she took her children to the duckyard, the others pecked and mocked the gray duckling. "He's too big and ugly," they said. Even his own siblings wished he were gone. So he ran away. He wandered through marshes, meeting wild ducks and geese who told him he was too ugly to marry into their kind. He nearly escaped a brutal hunt, was taken in by a woman with a cat and hen who scolded him for wanting to swim, and finally faced a bitter winter alone. Frozen into the ice, he was rescued by a farmer, only to flee again when frightened by children and chaos. Then came spring. The ice melted, the air softened, life stirred again in the reeds, and the larks began to sing. The duckling, worn by hardship but alive, spread his wings, and to his surprise they were strong, much stronger than before. With powerful strokes they lifted him high above the marsh, above the trees, and carried him to a blooming garden, where apple trees wore crowns of blossoms, and lilacs leaned over a clear stream. From the thicket before him came 3 lovely white swans. They ruffled their feathers and swam lightly in the stream. The duckling recognized these noble creatures, and a strange feeling of sadness came upon him. "I shall fly near these royal birds, and they will peck me to bits, because I, who am so very ugly, dare to go near them. But I don't care. Better be killed by them than to be nipped by the ducks, pecked by the hens, kicked about by the hen-yard girl, or suffer such misery in winter." So he flew into the water, and swam toward the splendid swans. They saw him and swept down upon him with their rustling feathers raised. "Kill me," said the poor creature, and he bowed his head down over the water to wait for death. But what did he see there, mirrored in the clear stream? He beheld his own image, and it was no longer the reflection of a clumsy, dirty, gray bird, ugly and offensive. He himself was a swan. Being born in a duckyard does not matter, if only you are hatched from a swan's egg. He felt quite glad that he had come through so much trouble and misfortune, for now he had a fuller understanding of his own good fortune, and of beauty when he met with it. The great swans swam all around him and stroked him with their bills. Several little children came into the garden to throw grain and bits of bread upon the water. The smallest child cried, "Here's a new one," and the others rejoiced, "Yes, a new one has come." They clapped their hands and danced around, and ran to bring their father and mother. He thought about how he had been persecuted and scorned, and now he heard them all call him the most beautiful of all birds. The lilacs dipped their clusters into the stream before him, and the sun shone so warm, so heartening. He rustled his feathers and held his slender neck high, as he cried out with full heart, "I never dreamed there could be so much happiness when I was the ugly duckling." It's a simple yet powerful story. I especially love this sentence that I found in the translation I'd never seen before. It reads, "Being born in a duckyard does not matter if only you are hatched from a swan's egg." I don't think I fully understand it yet, but I think it's interesting because it talks about 2 beginnings. First, being born in a duckyard, and then the other beginning, you are hatched from a swan's egg. So you could see the beginning of this swan's life in 2 different ways. Both things happened. He was born in a duckyard, and he was hatched from a swan egg. But based on what you put more weight to influences the long-term outcome. He says, being born in a duck yard doesn't matter if only you are hatched from a swan's egg. And so I believe the same is true for us in our lives. We have checkered pasts, especially in our childhood. A lot of what we experienced and gone through was positive and negative. But I believe we all have power over how we respond to our circumstances. We can hold weight to the positive things that happened in our lives and choose to hold those near and dear to our hearts and make them a part of us. To focus on this bird as the swan and the beautiful life that it has come to discover for itself over the dark and fragile beginnings of being misinterpreted as a duck and being bullied by its own siblings. And so now here we are. We've learned a little bit about the self model, what it entails, how it's formed, and what it does for us in our lives, its positive and negative implications. And so let's ask the question, how do we gain awareness of our own self model? I've written this up at the top based on my research. You can't revise what you don't recognize. Before transformation comes awareness, a willingness to observe the patterns that have shaped how you see yourself. And I've listed a few mechanisms about how we can gain self-awareness of our own model in our minds. First, we have mindful observation. And here we can notice habitual self-narratives, phrases like, I've always messed things up, or I'm just not wired for success. Mindfulness and meditation are important because the mechanisms behind it are observation and awareness. But we are supposed to observe without judgment. And so mindfully observing our self-narratives means that we can pay attention to the tone and language that we use with ourselves. Are you harsh? Are you passive? Are you rigid? Are you forgiving? Are you compassionate with yourself? And with mindful observation, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to draw conclusions about the self-narratives we discover. We just need to gain awareness of them and meet them with acceptance. Along with mindful observation, a useful practice is journaling for pattern detection. With journaling, you can write about triggering events and the story your brain tells about them. As you write, you can track emotional responses and internal commentary that follows. With enough writing, over time, patterns emerge. And these patterns, not just only in what you write, but how you feel as you write, are clues to the deeper model running beneath the surface. This leads us to linguistic markers. As you pay attention to your internal commentary, listen for identity reinforcing phrases like, I'm just the type of person who, or that's not like me. These phrases often point to boundaries your self-model has drawn. It's like that map. There's boundaries to all of our self-models. And this leads us to emotional flashpoints. As we experience the world, or as we look back on our previous memories, hone in on intense motions, especially feelings of defensiveness or pride, shame, or self-sabotage. These are important because emotions are a signal. They're a combination of the unconscious mind and the conscious mind. They fuse the two together. And so they can give us a glimpse or a view into our unconscious self-model. A prompt for this would be, what situations trigger me the most? What part of me felt threatened or prideful? And what belief is that associated with? And lastly, I've put down the practice of autobiographical memory review. And here you can reflect on the narrative arc of your life story. What chapters do you emphasize in your life story? What parts are left out or dismissed? And which moments feel defining? Ultimately, your highlight reel and omissions reveal your self-model, and how it was formed. It's my hope that these suggestions are helpful because I know that for myself, awareness is always the first step to change. So I invite you to take some time for yourself to practice these exercises to help you gain self-awareness of your own self-model. Because without self-awareness, it's hard to change. And so this leads us to the final stage of the self-model, which is changing it. How do we attain wisdom in changing the self-model? And I've written here on the top that to change your self-model wisely, you must begin seeing yourself more truthfully, more compassionately, and more completely. We've discussed and learned previously that true wisdom is the skill of accurate perception. It includes 3 categories: epistemic truth, which is what is true versus false; ontological reality, what is real versus illusory; and lastly, interpersonal understanding, what is whole versus partial. And so you can think about wisdom as the skill of accurate perception in this regard as it relates to a self-model. Is how I see myself true or false? Is how I see myself real versus illusory? And is how I see myself whole or partial? You can break this down and apply it to every aspect of our self-model and expose the inaccuracies of your self-beliefs. And then I've written here a few things that I've found in my research about how we can change our self-model to educate it. The first is narrative reframing. And here we can rewrite our story from victim to survivor, mistake maker to learner. This changes how we frame the things that happen to us, or frame our behavior. So you can practice a redemptive frame. Turn suffering into meaning, and turn wounds into growth. A phrase like this: that pain didn't define me, it refined me. Another thing you can do is challenge your self-beliefs. You can use cognitive restructuring to identify evidence against negative identity claims. Or you can replace absolutist statements with open-ended ones. Just because you have self-beliefs and you have experiences that may reinforce those doesn't mean that that is what can happen forever. Change is still possible. And as you restructure your belief about yourself, you can make that change more easily attainable. And then I have identity-based habits. And this applies to behavior, specifically with habits. Don't wait to feel different. Act as the person you want to become. I remember having a conversation with my wife about a specific character attribute that I was struggling with and wanted to be for myself. And she told me that it would be important for me to believe that I am that already. If I could believe that in myself every day and act like I was, then eventually I would become that. And I think the same thing is happening with this practice of identity-based habits. If I feel like I'm an insecure person, I can build habits of being a confident person every day until I grow confidence. And then we have social scaffolding. And this points to the role of the social sphere that we have as humans. We can surround ourselves with people who mirror our evolving identity, not the outdated version. It's important to seek environments and roles that make new behavior feel natural. If you want to be creative, join a creative space. If you want to stop drinking, don't go to a bar. So think to yourself, who reflects the version of you you're trying to become? And then surround yourself around those people. And lastly, plasticity and patience. Ultimately, the self-model is neuroplastic. It can change, but it takes time. Neuroscience teaches us that neural pathways can be reshaped over time. Sustainable identity change is gradual, emotional, and experiential. Your self-model isn't a sentence, it's a structure. It was built slowly, layer by layer, over years, through experience, repetition, and emotion. And so to change it, it'll require the same. Just like any structure, it's open to renovation. But I hope you see in our conversation the role of belief in behavior change. Insight is the blueprint, action lays the bricks. It's useless to focus on action before you have the blueprint made. So, don't just change what you do, change what you believe is possible for someone like you. This is all a part of our self-model. And today I hope that you are able to learn a little bit about how you can help your own self-model to not be limiting to you, but rather encouraging. Next up, we'll think about others in the world in perception. How do we perceive others? And how do distorted views of ourselves often bleed into distorted views of relationships, community, and humanity? Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.